Welcome to the Master Your Mix podcast, helping engineers, producers, and artists create professional recordings and mixes, even from home. I'm your host, Mike and Davina. Let's get started. Hey, welcome to the Master Your Mix podcast. My name is Mike and Davina, and thanks for hanging out with me today. Today, my guest is Tony Hoffer, and if you're not familiar with Tony is a producer, engineer, and mixer who's worked with amazing artists such as Beck, Phoenix, Supergrass, M83, and so many more. And if you ever listen to any of his productions, they have such cool character to them. He's got this really cool style to his production where, the tracks just, they don't sound like typical rock songs. Like there's character, there's a personality to the tracks. And so that's one of the reasons why I wanted to bring him on here today. And we definitely dive deep into his process in terms of how he goes about achieving that. And he's got some really, really cool approaches to making tracks sound gritty, giving them that personality, and just making them sound different than what most people are used to hearing when it comes to a guitar or a drum set and that kind of thing. And so he gets into all of those processes on this episode and talks about the tools that he likes to use and just his overall philosophies on stuff. And it's really, really fascinating. So with that said, I think you're going to really enjoy this episode. So let's just jump right into it. Tony Hoffer, thank you so much for being on the Master Your Mix podcast. How's it going, man?
Good. Yeah. Thanks for having me.
Of course. For people who might not be familiar with you and who you are, what you do, and maybe some of the artists that you've worked with, can you give us that background on how you got started and what you're working on these days?
Yeah, sure. So I'm a record producer and a mixer and a musician. And I basically got started I was in a band for several years, and that was a great experience in that I got to spend time, or when we were in the studio, I really enjoyed that aspect of it the most. And then eventually I moved into the studio world. I got an internship at a studio in San Francisco, and then quickly moved up to like a staff engineer position. So I learned a lot about studio stuff. I was also able to go in the evenings and just kind of see how the different equipment worked and what happens if you plug this into that, and kind of make all of these mistakes during that time, that after hours time, and also kind of figure out what I liked, what sounds I liked, or what effect combinations were interesting to me, or how to emulate things that I liked on other records that I heard. So that was kind of a good time to test all of those things, and in a way, I guess, prepare myself for a few years later to getting my first, I guess, proper gig, which was with Beck, working on Beck Midnite Vultures. And I'd done a lot of stuff before that, but it would have been stuff that people wouldn't have heard of, thankfully, because probably wasn't the greatest. But yeah, the Beck, Midnite Vultures, that would have been that would have been a big milestone for me, which kind of got me on the map, so to speak. And Midnite Vultures, that album was nominated for 2 Grammys, and that caused sort of a lot of other things to happen after that. A lot of other projects, and putting me in different regions of the world, like, in France and the UK, which I've then gone on to do a lot of, work with a lot of artists from the UK and France, and have success with those artists as well as the US.
That's awesome.
And other countries as well. But early on, yeah, a lot of UK stuff and French stuff.
That's very cool. So I have to stop you there. Like, you kind of dismissed a lot of that work prior to that Midnite Vultures record as if it was like your learning time. And then that was the record that obviously, like, I think that that's a common story where, like, a lot of engineers will get that one hit record that then ends up spawning so much other work that came from it. But to get that record to begin with, I'm sure your music must have been sounding pretty great before that to get that kind of gig. Like, Beck was a pretty well-respected musician at that point, and, had the history. So you've had to have had the skills there to begin with, I'm sure, right? I've
always tried to do things that are different and but with a combination of things that are kind of happening, or or cool, or at least what I think is cool. So and I'm always trying to kind of push on that as hard as I can, and kind of push out on it to take that as far as I possibly can with the time that I have to do that. Whether I'm in the studio or back then we were in studios a lot. So yeah, a lot of the stuff that I was working on, like my own music at the time, it was kind of crazy stuff. Very, I had at least five samplers. So it was very, it was heavily programmed, but there was also guitar. It was kind of like Beck music in a way, where, a lot of those records, there's a lot of sampling going on, but then there'd be instruments played on top of the samples or loops or whatever, and songs kind of written around that. So I was kind of doing something similar. I wouldn't say like as accessible as what Beck was doing. My stuff was probably a little more clubby, or kind of a little more underground sounding, a little too far possibly on the weirder side of things, mixing too many strange combinations together. But it was cool, or I thought it was, and some other people thought it was. But yeah, it was just a lot of doing, just doing a lot of songs. Some would be cool, some not, and learning from the ones that are great and learning from the ones that are maybe not so great. And also knowing if it's kind of not great, don't spend a lot of time on it, and, just moving fast. And I think working fast in the studio, that was a big, that prepared me for when I did have the opportunity, like, to work with an artist like Beck. I was ready to go. I was very fast in the studio with engineering and, in production. So anything that any idea we had, it could be executed rather quickly, and we would know quickly whether it was a good idea or not a good idea, and then we can get on to the next idea. So I think that was a pretty big asset as well.
Yeah, that makes sense. It sounds like you were definitely working on your skills, and it would have been natural for Beck to want to work with you because your skills were there and your creative vision was aligned to begin with too. So yeah, obviously, who wouldn't want to work with someone like that?
Yeah, yeah. I mean, and I was a huge fan of his, obviously. With the prior music that he had put out, like Mellow Gold was brilliant. So yeah, it was cool. Do
you feel like after getting that chance to work with Beck, obviously it generated a lot of new clients for you, I'm sure, but what was that experience like working with him? Like, do you feel like working on that record has maybe influenced some of your subsequent albums ever since? Or
yeah, without a doubt, for sure. Yeah, I mean, we spent quite a bit of time together. It was over a year working on working on what would become Midnite Vultures, and and many other songs that haven't been released yet, that are quite good actually. But yeah, I would say that definitely, I definitely learned a lot from working with Beck, and things that I use to this day for sure.
Yeah. It's funny. One of my other guests on the podcast is an engineer named Dean Nelson. I'm not sure if you're familiar with Dean, but Dean also worked with Beck, and he ended up producing a record for one of my bands. And I just, like, watching the way he worked, it was such a creative way. And he was like, yeah, this is all like Beck, just like wearing it, like he learned all this stuff from just watching him. And, it sounds like just from what I gather between the productions that you've worked on and the stuff that I know Dean's worked on and the Beck stuff, like it sounds like there's kind of an energy that Beck looks for in an engineer.
I guess so. Yeah. I don't know. But yeah, there's a lot that I learned. I mean, some of the things that I still apply to this day is, moving fast, not getting bogged down on certain things. Although, sometimes in working with Beck, it can take a while for certain songs if we're chasing a certain thing, but usually it's well worth it. And, the time put in is well worth it. But yeah, being okay with things not being super tight, and having the feel be a certain way, and having things be loosey-goosey, whatever, swimming in the rhythm, but having other things super locked in. And it takes, I don't know, because I'll do that a lot. I mean, there's been so many productions where I'll do that, where the initial basic tracks that we're doing are pretty, they may not sound great until we start getting some other things on it. But, the bass, drums, and guitar, they may sound a little rough. And it's definitely a thing of like, look, everyone, just trust me. Like, let's just see this through. I think it's going to be good. And then sure enough, you get a couple other things on there and get some vocals on there. And then it all starts coming together and it sounds really fresh. Not everything is quantized to the grid. It definitely has its own thing. And it just now somehow stands apart from everything else.
That's very cool.
But yeah, but that's, and that's something, with a lot of the stuff that I did with Beck over those years, it was that, where some things would be super loose, where almost falling apart, but then there'd be one element, maybe a bass or whatever it is, some guitar holding it together. Or maybe the drums would be really tight, but then the guitar that he would put on would just be really lazy and it kind of gives it that thing.
That's very cool. Well, it kind of ties me to something I was curious to ask you about that maybe is related to what you're talking here. But I've heard you say on some other interviews before that sometimes you'll like to take organic elements in a mix and then run them through like a synth or something like that to give them like an electronic feel or make it sound different than that natural organic sound. I'm curious to know, like, can you give us some examples of maybe times that you've done that, and what does that process normally look like for you? Like, what kind of tools are you typically running through?
So yeah, I'll do it with any element, whatever element, basically whatever element seems like it needs a lift or a transformation of sorts. So, and the tools that I would use for that typically are either an ARP 2600, which has that's like a modular synth from the 70s that is just incredible. I have a vintage one. I swear the thing has kind of like a soul in it, somewhere in the electronics. It at times feels like it's alive, and what it gives out, what it does and what it gives you is just so beautiful sometimes, or so nasty or whatever. But it has an input on it, and so you can run anything into that input. And so I'll sometimes run drums through it or percussion. It's got a great filter. It's got amazing spring reverb. You can distort things with it. You can kind of modulate different aspects of it. And then I also use a Korg MS-20 quite a bit. That also has an input on it. And I use those all the time. I just did the new Travis record that's coming out, I think, this summer, but there's quite a few songs on there, maybe at least 3, where I recorded the drummer playing certain elements of drums and certain elements of percussion, and then I kind of built up a rhythm, like a rhythm bed, and then I ran that whole thing through the MS-20. And so I ran the left side. I made like a stereo thing. So the left side, ran that through the MS-20 with set a certain way, distorting a little bit probably, filtered a certain way, and then I ran the right side and then kind of made it stereo-ish. And it's cool. It just has it has much more vibe than just having all of those rhythmic elements being clean, or if I were to add a little bit of distortion like in the computer, it has a lot more flavor to it.
Yeah, it's such an interesting way of getting creative sounds. And I was curious to know, like, why you prefer to do it that way as opposed to like finding existing synth patch sounds or programming stuff. But I guess it's maybe just because it's more of an organic feel to you. Yeah,
I mean, first and foremost, it's kind of fun to do that, to get the synth, plug the thing in. But there is something that happens, they're a little noisy. The inputs on them, you're gaining a little bit of noise and a little bit of grit, even by not doing anything, just running it through there and not changing anything, it is affecting the sound noticeably. And so I like that. I don't like things in general being too clean. So I'm always trying to find ways to dirty things up or grit things up in often kind of gentle ways. So not oversaturating sounds, but just a little bit of grit here, a little bit of grit there, a little salt and pepper, then the whole thing starts to sound alive and kind of starts pushing out of the speakers a bit. If you go too far with it, then it doesn't sound right, and things just saturate and sound kind of mushy, and you lose your transients. But yeah, running it through a synth or through pedals, you just kind of get a little bonus of a little bit of noise and a little whatever, that you won't get with a plugin.
Yeah, it's very cool. Well, it's interesting you're talking about grit, because it's definitely an element of your mixes that I can hear quite a bit of, and it is something that gives your tracks like a unique characteristic. It's very cool. But when it comes to like using overdrive or distortion and whatnot, I know a lot of people listening to this, maybe they just don't know like how far is too far with it, and they're afraid to like push things or commit to sounds on the way in. So I'm curious to know more about your process or your way of thinking about it when it comes to adding that kind of stuff. Like how do you determine what's too far, or what are you listening for?
I mean, it would it would really depend on the music and the sound, but because sometimes I'm going for just subtle grit, and sometimes I'm also going for just complete annihilation. So it just depends on what the like the emotion, like what's supposed to be happening with this sound. What feeling is it supposed to have and give off in the track? Is it something that's supposed to be just super gnarly and terrifying, or is it something that needs to just kind of pop out of the speakers a little bit? And usually, I find to get things to pop out, a little bit of grit is a good trick for that.
Yeah, it sounds like you're maybe listening for some transients and stuff like that kind of information to make sure that you're getting what you need and it's not getting lost, right?
Yeah. I mean, again, it's like
obviously
it really depends, of course, but usually, I'm listening for the transients to make sure there will be a point where the transient is gone. So I usually don't want that, but then sometimes I do. But it's more common that I don't want to kill my transients. So I'll be grading things up to a point where things just start to sound exciting and kind of come forward a little bit, and then I'll probably stop at that point with that sound. And but then sometimes there might be sounds like on a bass guitar or whatever on a chorus, like I want it to explode, and I'm okay with it being just a brick, a wall of sound, and I'm fine for the transient to be gone, because I'll get transients another way.
Gotcha. Yeah, I guess it's about prioritizing what elements need that transient information and which ones can sit further back in the mix, right?
Exactly. Yeah. And the other thing too is like not everything can be super transient and super, clicky or whatever, attacky. If everything did, then it might be like, oh man, it's too much to listen to. But so yeah, it depends. But rarely am I try not to go too far with it, because that usually doesn't sound good.
Yeah. I think it's just about like training your ears to identify like how even a little bit can go a long way, and just that cumulative effect of like adding multiple tracks that have a little bit of this grit, and it just adds up, right?
Yeah, it really does. I mean, if you listen to like, Beatles and Stones records, there's a lot of grit on those recordings, but like the guitars are distorted and things are distorted, but it's not saturated. It just sounds exciting.
Mm-hmm.
If you go too far with the amp or whatever it is they were using, then it just starts to be, you're losing the chords of the guitar or whatever the instrument is. You start losing things. And I guess it depends on the genre, because there's actually, there's many genres where full on annihilation that's the thing for the genre. So I don't know. I guess it's all subjective and depends, but I know I can get things to pop out of the speaker if I'm doing a little bit of grit here and there. I know like I'm good.
Yeah. And is that something that you normally take care of in the mixing stage, or are you getting those sounds right from the beginning and recording them on the way in like that?
If it's something that I'm producing, I'll kind of dial the sounds in as we're going and commit. And then when I mix, I'll probably add a little bit more. But maybe just a little bit. It may not need much, but because then you get into a thing of when you're really analyzing how everything's going to sit together, you then sometimes need, the kick individually is going to need a little bit of grit to get it to pop out of the speaker the way I want it to, and or the snare or whatever. Versus if it's hard to make those choices when you're recording, in the production phase, because I wouldn't want to go too far with certain things like that. So but usually I'm grading things up in the production.
Yeah, it makes sense.
The productions are definitely not clean. They're not like, we're going to save it to the mix. Like I'm trying to get it as realized as possible in production. I don't like saving stuff for later.
Yeah. And do you typically, with your workflow, like to track different instruments like individually, or are you like a live off the floor kind of guy, or what's that look like?
Depends on the artist.
Yeah.
I do both. So I've done a lot of records where we're recording things with everyone playing together, even vocals, no click, that sort of thing. And then I've done many records where, particularly the ones that maybe lean a little more electronic, where we're building things up bit by bit. And sometimes the artist might be just one person,
Fair.
So there's not a band there's not a group of musicians to play off of each other. But, it just depends what the strength is of the artist. If the strength is, if it's four or five people that when they all play together, they sound amazing, then we should be mindful of that and try to capture some of that. If it's 4 or 5 people that are, maybe don't sound amazing when they play together, I don't know, that'd be a strange situation, but I'm sure it exists. Then it might be better to go, bit by bit, build things up. So yeah, it depends, but yeah.
Yeah. And I imagine that like it's easier to commit to things like grit when you can hear the whole band playing at once, because you're hearing how everyone's instrument is really coming together. Whereas when you're piecing it bit by bit, maybe you do need to play a little bit more safe just to not put yourself in a corner with it a little bit, right?
With grit, maybe. Yeah, maybe. I definitely wouldn't want to go too far with distortion and grit on elements. With guitars and basses and things like that, or synths, if I'm gritting those up, I'll go for what seems right at that moment. I'll just overload it, whatever needs to happen. I'll commit to the idea that I hear in my head, the sound. But in terms of like gritting drums or vocals, I won't go real far with that in tracking.
Makes
just
sense.
Out of it's maybe a little too dangerous. I like to be reckless, but that might be a little too much for me. My comfort zone. But yeah, man, like I don't know. It's important for me to, as we're recording, to just really have everything be as realized as possible as we're doing it. So getting the sounds, taking a minute, to get some, if it's guitar or whatever, getting the sound, not saving it for later, if possible. I do document things. I'll take the great thing with cameras on phones is you can just document pedal setups or, whatever settings we're using. I can document it and I can write on it with text on the iPhone. So I can go back if we do need to recall something, which sometimes does happen. Sometimes I go too far with something, and inevitably we got to go back and recall it. I always grab a DI, so I can always reamp if need be. But it's it's rare. That maybe happens 3% of the time. 97% of the time I'm good, and then there might be a 3% chance that we're going to be coming back to this, especially if it's a sound that's a little out there and pushing on the comfort zone of the artist.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah, then we'll be revisiting this quite possibly. Yeah,
makes sense. Well, another thing I was curious to ask you about, and you kind of talked about this a little bit earlier, is sampling. And sampling seems to play a pretty big role in your productions, and maybe something that gives it kind of your sound, your taste. So I'm curious to know, like, when it comes to adding samples to productions, what's your normal approach to that, and how are you incorporating samples but still maintaining like the authenticity or like originality of an artist? Like, how do you find, like, what's your way of incorporating stuff and finding that balance?
Yeah, I love using samples, and that can mean a lot of things. It can mean sampling something from another source, like another recording. It could also mean sampling something from the artist that we play, and then I sample it and then, manipulate it. It can be also just using samples like drum sounds, kick, snares, whatever, building up a beat, programming things, that way. It could also be like writing. I have an EMU SP1200. That's basically like a sampling. It's like a drum machine that's a sampler and sequencer. So you can kind of load in sounds, make beats or songs or whatever. And then I can take that, plug that into a song that I'm working on with an artist, and then use it as sort of like a textural thing. So in some ways, I suppose the way I use sampling, it's usually for a textural thing. Now that I think of it, it's rare that it would be the center point of the song. It's rare that the sample would be the main thing that we then add some other elements to that sample, but the sample is like 80% of the song. Very rare that I do that. It's usually more, for the most part, it's usually more of adding, it's a way for me to add an interesting texture, whether it's a sort of futuristic texture or a nostalgic texture, or a kind of broken texture, whatever it is, a dreamy texture. That's kind of how I'll use. That's how I use it.
Gotcha. Yeah, it's interesting because, like, I definitely think that with what you said there about, maybe making something sound nostalgic or futuristic, like I definitely see where you're coming from with that, where you can definitely add a cool, almost like era sort of to the music by adding some samples underneath. I was just curious to know if that's maybe something that you're discussing ahead of time with the artist to figure out kind of what kind of direction they're wanting to go, or is that just something you're like, I just think this needs a little something else, I'm going to throw it underneath.
Yeah, it's usually that. Honestly, if I have a conversation with the artist, some artists I think would be fine with it. They're wanting that, and they're wanting me to kind of explore those possibilities. Other artists are, they may not understand it, and they may not understand the process, because it can take a minute to do that. You got to find the sample, like that. Fair. Can take some time. So sometimes I'll just be like, look, I'll just do it on my own, or I'll be like, hey, give me like 20 minutes, 30 minutes, whatever, 45 minutes, an hour, whatever, to try something that I think could be really cool. And so that's it. So it kind of goes that way as well. But there's been many songs where there'll be some part that's that is part of the song, let's say a guitar part, and it's just not happening. Like, it just doesn't sound cool, no matter how we change it and invert it and different pedals and whatever. It's a guitar. It sounds too rock or it's just not, it doesn't have like a twist, because I'm also always looking for some kind of a twist, like a little fun thing, a little spin, a little something to put, you know, to make this song different in some ways than other songs, and you know, to just give it personality and character. So sometimes what I'll do in those cases when it's just not happening, that element, is I'll remove the element, but maybe be mindful of the rhythm that it's doing, and then I'll find a sample and mangle the sample, and then take that guitar, if it's a guitar, let's just say, send that guitar to a gate and have it gate the sample. So the original guitar that was not sounding right is going to a gate. And so whenever that guitar plays, it's going to open up the gate, which is going to open up the sample. It'll make the sample play.
Gotcha.
And so you can now get this same rhythm, which is what we need, that kind of feel from the guitar, but we'll have this crazy texture happening. There's a song, a good example of that, of something that I worked on, is a song from a band called the Griswolds, and the song's called 16 Years, where it's exactly that. You know, the guitar was, we just couldn't get it sounding great. You know, the part was cool, but it just wasn't right. So I found a sample, mangled the hell out of it, and then sent that guitar to the sample, to the gate to control the sample, essentially. And it completely transformed the song, and then it made it sound really cool and fresh, and kind of gave it a really cool vibe.
That's awesome.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's definitely a unique way to do it. And but it makes sense. Like if you're trying to preserve what's there, but add something cool that doesn't get super distracting either, then yeah, that gate technique's a really cool way of doing it for sure.
Yeah, it's, in a way, it's kind of the best of both worlds. You're still getting that feel of the instrument, but you're getting a whole new, it expands the palette immensely, you know, having that sample or you know, whatever it is you go with. But yeah, it's cool.
For sure. It's interesting because, like, just hearing you talk about how you like to have your records kind of have character, you know, I would think that you could just as easily go too far with some of the creative decisions and trying to like get too much character. And I know with like a lot of synth-based music, or especially because people are now working in the box, like there can be that tendency to want to just add layer upon layer because you have that ability. And you can certainly go too far with it. So what's your philosophy on like layering in productions and knowing how far is too far with that?
I've always been somewhat of a minimalist in that regard. And I think it possibly that comes from being ingrained of, you know, working on with 4-track cassette, that format for years. When I was a teenager, you know, you have 4 tracks and you might have to bounce some things around. So you really got to make everything count. And then early on when I started off, you know, we were using 24-track machines, you know, 2-inch tape, 24 tracks, which is really not 24 tracks, because, you know, a few tracks, you need a track for time code, you need a click probably, and you need maybe like a buffer track so that the time code doesn't mess up your hi-hat or whatever, but or vice versa. But so you know, you don't really have a lot of tracks, and I just kind of figured out early on how to, from an arrangement standpoint, how to say what I need to say in those, you know, whatever, 21 tracks. And so in terms of loading up synths on a chorus to try and make it bigger. And the other thing I was going to say is that I like to work fast. So loading up, so those two things, being minimal and working fast, neither of those are conducive to stacking up dozens of synths
Fair.
on a chorus, because A, it's going to take a long time, and B, it's the opposite of minimal. Because I feel that, you know, I can get things to sound bigger if I'm minimal. I can make 2 synths, or even 1 for that matter, sound much bigger than 6. Plus guitars, plus, you know, strings, plus whatever. And yeah, so plus it takes time to find all those layers. I would rather find 1 or 2 sounds that are just awesome and have lots of character, and it's very clear what they are, versus having 6 sounds or 8 sounds that are all awesome in their own way, but then you end up not hearing any one of those awesome sounds, and it's just like, it just reads as synth, a lot of synth. Now, with all that said, there are many artists that I've worked with that load up the synths, and those records, synths and strings and guitars and everything, and those records sound phenomenal. And those would typically be things that I mixed, you know, because if I were producing it, I probably wouldn't have done that, because I like to move fast, and like I said, it's, you know, it's going to take a lot of time to find those sounds, and B, it's going to kind of make my stereo field smaller, essentially. But with that said, yeah, there's many artists like M83 is a perfect example of that, where the songs are pretty dense and they sound gorgeous, and it works. So that's the beauty of making music.
Yeah.
It's all like, you can say one thing, but then it works the opposite perfectly well, and that's what's great. So,
yeah, absolutely.
But yeah, but I'm inclined to kind of keep things minimal, and then add things, carefully add things as needed, versus, all right, we're doing synth on these courses, let's load up, you know, a bunch of sounds and whatever, you know. With M83, like, those sounds are all, you know, they're all very carefully chosen, obviously, and it's all, you know, a lot of time goes into that. Those records take a long time to make, and they're meticulous, but yeah.
Yeah, that makes sense. And I'm kind of with you on that, like, where you kind of just want to have the sound right from the beginning and not have to like add a whole bunch of different things together to hopefully land on the sound that you were going for. Like, I could see how that can just be a super frustrating, time consuming process to, you know, hope that you're going to, okay, I'm going to start with this bass synth sound, and then it's missing something. Let's mess around with more sounds for a half hour, and then something else. And it just takes forever. And maybe you don't end up with anything that's that great, you know, maybe you get too far.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. I mean, and I will think of it with the song, you know, I am thinking in terms of, because, you know, when I'm producing, I'm also thinking down the road is like what the mix will be like, and how difficult or easy things will be when I go to mix it. But with synths, you know, I'm always thinking of frequency range. I want to make sure my low end is sounding good. The middle kind of synth area, that, you know, that middle synth is going to be important, because whatever synth is in the mid range is the one that most people are going to hear if they're listening on phones or small, or, you know, laptops, whatever, small speakers. Like, that's the one that's going to kind of probably jump out the most. And then there might be something higher up, a more ethereal or brighter synth that kind of sits quietly on top of that. There could be something that's arpeggiated that goes in there. So, you know, I'm trying to stack things up a certain way so that, you know, there could be a few synths, but what I try not to do is have a bunch of synths all in that kind of middle area, or 3 synth basses, or, you know, plus electric bass.
That makes
sub
sense. Yeah. That makes sense. Well, you mentioned M83, and that reminded me of another question that I had for you, which was that I saw an interview that you did with Pensato's Place, and on that interview, Dave Pensato mentioned, and rightfully so, he mentioned that you have a great knack for using a song's dynamics as hooks. And I totally agree with that. And a perfect example of it that I could think of immediately was Midnight City by M83. Like that drum hook that right at the beginning, like, I love that drum fill. And to me, that's like such a dynamic hook in itself. So I was curious to know, like, when it comes to creating hooks in music, what are you typically looking for, and how do you know when to lean into something that's maybe more dynamic based or more melodic based or something else?
Yeah, well, I mean, in terms of hooks, I think of them, you know, there's several categories of hooks, and when I'm producing or mixing, I'm in the back of my mind, I'm kind of thinking like, where does this hook fit, or can this be turned into a hook? And, you know, so there's obviously lyric hooks, there's melodic hooks, which could be a vocal thing, but it could also be a synth part, could be a melodic hook, or a guitar part. There's rhythmic hooks, like in the case of what you're talking about, and kind of with a lot of electronic music, you kind of hear a lot of rhythmic hooks, like, you know, a triplet thing or whatever. And then there's sonic hooks, which could be, again, more so in electronic leaning stuff, where it, you know, it could be the reverb, the pulse, you know, the pulsating reverb on some synth, this 7-second tail is creating some kind of sonic hook, or the way that an effect on the vocal, whatever, that is a hook in itself. And so when I'm producing or mixing, I'm definitely thinking with that, you know, of how can I, it's not just like lyric hooks or vocal melody hooks. Where can I grab a sonic hook, like a delay throw, or you know, whatever, making some lyric, some line get really distorted or really reverby or whatever, you know, kind of do some cool sonic thing with a certain moment there. So yeah, so that's kind of how I think of it. And yeah, with that M83, that's a good example of grit, but having the transients being, you know, having them pop, basically. That feels very transient.
Yeah. And that track, like, it has so many little ear hooks to it, you know, like there's the drums, there's like the synth line that's in there, there's like, or whatever that sound is, you know, the bah, 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 bah. Like there's so many cool elements of that track that I think just keep you engaged in the song, and it's very fascinating.
Yeah, it's a brilliant song, and you know, it's there are many unorthodox things that went into the production of that song, like that hook that you're talking about, that melodic hook and sonic hook. It's, you know, it's both. That's Anthony's voice, the who is M83. It's his voice that's been processed heavily. Obviously, he doesn't normally sound like that when he talks, but but yeah, it's that is you know, working in doing unorthodox things will get you to stand apart from other artists and other songs. I've always believed that. All the artists that I've always loved and that grew up with did basically that. You know, they were kind of doing things the wrong way, and so yeah, that song is a good example of that.
Makes sense. So then how do you know, because you could, I mean, this I guess goes back to what you were talking about earlier with being a minimalist, but like, how do you know when the production should stop on a track and you're just like, this is a song, like this is ready to go?
Yeah, I mean, I've been asked that before. You just kind of know. I think when you've exhausted the ideas that you wanted, you know, you've checked off every main idea that you wanted to get through. And you've tried them. Hopefully many have worked, some maybe not. And there's nothing else on the list, and it feels pretty good. And I think probably at that point, you know, there's kind of a marination stage. Just kind of put the song away for a few days or a week, and then come back to it and see, you know, listen with fresh ears. And it's like, yeah, it still seems pretty good. Seems like maybe now it's more just kind of mix stuff. And so production's done. Let's move it into the mix category now. So yeah, that would be, I think, how I do it. Just exhausting all of the possible things that me and the artist wanted to try with it.
That makes sense.
But yeah, I don't like, I like to move quick. And I like having momentum. I like having perspective. I feel like you can have good perspective if you're moving fast. If you're stretching things out, you can get lost really easily, and then you can't even tell, like, is it better? Is it worse? It's different, but you know, you just get lost in the forest. So with that, I like to just get all the ideas in, put it away, let it marinate, come back to it a couple days later, and then it'll indicate what else it needs, or maybe not.
Gotcha.
And yeah, and I think that also that helps me from putting on too many things and going too crazy.
Yeah. Well, you talked about how, like, you know, moving something from the production stage to the mixing stage. What does that look like to you? Like, how do you divide up those two processes, or are you kind of mixing as you're going along with the production, and, you know, maybe just like adding some fine tweaking at the end to call it done?
It's always been hard for me to produce and mix at the same time. Like mix, you know. When I'm producing, I'm trying to make the song sound, you know, as good as I can. But I know that when I'm able to kind of mute a bunch of things, tweak some levels, and really open the thing up, crack the thing open, and roll up my sleeves, I can get the mix 200% better. You know, it's very hard to do that while you're recording vocals and other things, because, you know, your levels are changing. Basically, whatever the last thing is that you recorded is going to be the loudest thing in your rough mix when you're tracking. So it's like you're gonna have a screaming tambourine on there, or the vocals are going to be way too loud, or you know, the backing vocals are going to be way too loud compared to the lead vocal and anything else for that matter. If backing vocals were the last thing you did. So I kind of need that space and that time to mute a bunch of things, maybe rebuild the track up. And there's sometimes are cool things that are happening in the rough mix that we're really liking. But and I'll be mindful of that to make sure that these certain relationships are similar. But I can definitely get things to I can get it to definitely sound more like a record if I'm able to move it into a different phase and just focus on mixing. Gotcha.
Well, I know before we hit record, we were both talking about like losing objectivity on a track when you've heard something a million times, and it sounds like, yeah, for you need that separation maybe from the track just to get that objectivity back. Do you typically take a gap between like mix time and production time?
Yeah. I build that in. I also typically take a gap between production time within production time, I should say. So meaning kind of like what I was saying earlier, if we're working on a song, we'll spend a day, maybe day and a half. And in that day and a half, we'll get pretty far. We'll get pretty deep into it. I usually have targets set for each day. And, and they're pretty full on days, like just hammering through, trying to try every possibility that we wanted to try over that day or day and a half. And then by then it's like, it should be sounding pretty good. I'll just put it away at that point. And then we'll move on to something else, maybe start another song. And then in a few days or a week, we'll come back to that first one and just see what it's needing and do what's needed. And then by that point, it's probably pretty much there. It's pretty much ready to be mixed, at least, But having that perspective, it really helps to have that.
Absolutely. So then when it comes to the mixing side of things, how do you know when you're done with a mix?
Again, when I've exhausted, when I've listened through the song, how many ever times, and I've exhausted all possible changes from that I can find or that I need to make or that I feel I need to make, then I would say I'm pretty much there. When I'm listening through and I'm not really hearing anything, then typically what I'll do, and I'll usually be on my main speakers for the majority of that. When I get to that point, then I'll kind of move to a different set of speakers or headphones and then spend a little bit of time there and just referencing on different listening setup, and then see if anything new comes up. And then when nothing new is coming up, it's done and ready for the artist to get their ears on it.
Makes sense. So then the last question I always ask all my guests is, in your opinion, what ultimately makes a great mix?
A very subjective question, but I'll tell you, for me, in my opinion, when I'm mixing something, what makes a great mix is just something that amplifies whatever cool stuff is happening with the songwriting and the song's production. So whatever is amplifying that and making it even better, that I would say is what makes a good mix. And that could also mean that it's very lo-fi and there's no low end and it's very dark and muffly or whatever. If it's doing that, if it's making the production and the song come across way better, enough to kind of, pull people in and interest people, then I'd say it's a good mix.
Love it. That's great, man. Well, Tony, thank you for taking the time to do this. I really appreciate it. If people want to learn more about you, follow you online, or maybe even work with you, what's the best way for them to do that?
Just Instagram, probably. Just hit me up on Instagram or my website, TonyHoffer.com. My Instagram is Tony Hoffer Music, I think. Hold on a second.
I'll add a link to it in the show notes, so we got it there.
Good idea. Yeah, I don't DM myself a lot, so I'm not sure.
Yeah, you're not tagging yourself. Yeah, right on, man. Tony, again, thank you so much for doing this. I really appreciate learning more about your process and getting some insight into some of the techniques that you use. Definitely some really cool things to try. And you've made me start thinking about wanting to go back and run stuff through synths now. It sounds like a fun process.
You should, yeah. Thank you. Yeah, thanks for having me. I really enjoyed the chat.
So there you have it. That was my interview with Tony Hoffer, and I thought it was really fascinating to learn his approach to giving tracks grit and character. And I thought it was really cool to hear him talk about how he likes to run stuff through synths. And it's just such a cool way to go about doing it. And like you said, it sounds like a lot of fun to do, It gives you something that is unique and that isn't something that's a patch that you can find in your plugins or on your synths to begin with. It just gives something really cool and different. And it makes sense when you listen to his productions. You can hear, like I said at the very beginning, like there are some really interesting sounds in the tracks that he works on. And I think a lot of that is the product of the innovative ways that he goes about manipulating sounds. So yeah, I thought it was really cool to dig into that, and definitely has me wanting to see what I can do of just messing around with different synth patches or, running things through pedals and stuff like that. I think it sounds like a really fun way to work and would be really inspiring and also help you get some pretty cool tones along the way. So yeah, definitely give those suggestions a shot and see what kind of cool stuff you can come up with too. I really enjoyed this episode, and I hope that you did too. If you did, please make sure to subscribe to the podcast. That way you're notified about all new episodes as they go live each and every Wednesday morning. And if everything goes as planned, this episode should be episode 199, which means that next week's episode is going to be episode 200, which blows my mind that we made it that far. I can't believe that this many years later, we're still recording the podcast and making it up to 200 episodes. There have been so many great ones along the way. So I'm really excited for that one. And we're going to try to do something special for that one. So yeah, definitely make sure to stay tuned and check out next week's episode once it goes live. Now, one of the topics that came up in this podcast a bunch of times was the idea of knowing how far to take something or knowing when you haven't gone far enough. Or just in general, just being aware of what the tools that you're using are doing to the sounds that you're working on. And so you can tell when you've got the right balance of EQ or distortion or compression or all that kind of stuff. Now, this is something I hear constantly from a lot of people, that they're just not sure how far to take things. They're not sure if their mixes sound good, and they're feeling kind of lost and confused as to what to do. So if you're interested in getting help with your tracks and you need someone that can objectively listen to your tracks and give you actionable steps to take in terms of how far to go when it comes to things like EQ or compression or effects, and you ultimately want your tracks to sound as good as your favorite records, if you want direction and clarity on that process, that is something I would love to help you with. And that's something that I can help you with inside of my coaching program, Amplitude. In that program, I work one-on-one with my students, showing you a complete process for recording, editing, and mixing your tracks, being creative along the way, and then giving you feedback along the way as well. So as you're recording your tracks or as you're editing or as you're mixing, you can submit your tracks and get actionable feedback to help make sure that you're achieving the sounds that you hear in your head and getting those to come out of the speakers. So if you're interested in learning more about this program, make sure to visit MasterYourMix.com/amplitude, and you can find all the details on the program there. And then I'd love to hop on a call with you to learn more about you and your goals and your current processes, to identify what areas to focus on in order to help you see the fastest improvement and ultimately get the results that you're truly after. So once again, if you're interested in learning more, make sure to visit MasterYourMix.com/amplitude, and you can get all the details there. And with that said, we've reached the end of this episode, and I can't wait to chat with you in the next one. We'll talk soon. Take care. Thanks for listening to the Master Your Mix podcast. To have your questions answered, submit your questions to questions@masteryourmix.com. Please go to iTunes and subscribe and leave a review. And for more information on how you can improve your mixes, visit masteryourmix.com.